Okay, so here we are, moving into chapter 3 now, atoms and elements. So it's actually starting to sound like chemistry. Can you believe that? We went through chapter 1 and 2, and we talked about a lot of different things and a little bit about chemistry, but now we're going to dive right into it. In this first subtopic, we're going to look at elements and symbols. So in order to understand chemistry and to look at the language we use in chemistry, we have to get used to the formalism, the symbolism that we use here in chemistry. And so we'll spend the next several minutes looking at elements and their symbols. If you remember back to chapter 2, we talked about classification of matter, and we talked about elements and compounds as being pure substances, and then we had our mixtures. So of course, this is just a reminder, elements are pure substances. They're the fundamental building blocks from which all other things are built. So compounds are made up of two or more elements, and then the elements themselves, some that occur in nature. We see here gold does occur as the element in nature. Carbon also occurs as either diamond or soot or graphite in nature. Aluminum, we see here some aluminum metal, that does not occur in nature and is actually a relatively new thing for humans to be able to manipulate. Just over a century or so that we've been able to make metallic aluminum through electrochemistry, and initially it was quite rare and expensive. Crowns were made for royalty out of aluminum with the first amounts of aluminum made. And then, of course, we discovered how to make it very, very cheaply. It's one of the most abundant elements on Earth, and therefore nowadays we just toss out aluminum foil as if it's garbage once we've used it, I hope. But anyway, it used to be quite rare and expensive, but nowadays we can make it very easily and inexpensively. Here we see table 3.1 from the text, and we see some common elements with their names. Actually, the naming of the elements is a very interesting topic, and there's been a lot written about it. Asimov, Isaac Asimov, the famous physicist and author, has written about the words from the myths, and we see here a number of mythological names: uranium for the planet Uranus, titanium after the Titans in Greek mythology. The halogens, chlorine and iodine, that are represented here. Chloros is yellowish green or greenish yellow, as we see, and that's the color of the gas. Iodis is violet. Magnesium comes from the mineral that we use to isolate the elements, magnesia. Also milk of magnesia, you may have taken that for stomach aches in the past. Californium, now it's not so much mythology, but places, so California. We also have berkelium for Berkeley, California, where californium and berkelium were discovered. Curium, after Marie and Pierre Curie. Copernicium, one of our most recently named elements. Nicholas Copernicus, so the Copernic Center here in Vestal, a local connection. And of course he was an astronomer, but that's where we get the elements. They're made in the stars, and so that's a nod to astronomy in one of our more recent element names. So you see the element name and then the symbol, which is what we'll tend to use. The symbol is much more convenient than writing out the whole name. So the first 20 or so elements we should know name and symbol by heart. Other ones, if I were to have more elaborate ones, I would give you the symbol or the name, depending on what you needed for a problem that involved one of the more recent elements, or at least one of the elements that we have lower in the periodic table. Some have been known since ancient times, like gold and lead, so I shouldn't say recent, but the heavier elements that we may encounter. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about those symbols. The element symbols have to follow our convention, and we get really strict on this, so be careful. In order to be an official symbol, it has to represent the name of an element. Oftentimes the element name and symbol don't seem to go hand in hand, but typically they involve the letters that we use in the English name. Sometimes wolfram, for instance, is what tungsten is known in other parts, so the W doesn't make sense for the English name tungsten, but the W certainly makes sense for those who call it wolfram. Gold, lead, we talked about those already as being ancient elements, so they have their ancient names, the Latin names for those two, and so their symbols, AU for gold and PB for lead, don't make sense with the English name, but typically they make sense, and they always start with a capital letter, and they may have just that capital letter, or they may have a lowercase lowercase letter that follows. But that's our rule. 1 or 2 letters, always a capital letter, and then if there's a second letter, it has to be a lowercase. It can't be a capital that you write lowercase. So if we look here over at cobalt or calcium in particular, it can't be a capital C and then a small capital A. It has to be a capital C and a lowercase a. We get really strict on that, so just be careful with your writing. That's why it's nice to be able to type in Times New Roman font, and we're always on the same page. So we see some common examples of the 1-letter symbols there with carbon, nitrogen, fluorine, and oxygen, and then some 2-letter symbols, cobalt, calcium, aluminum, and magnesium. And all of these make sense because their English names go along with their element symbols, but as we said, that's not always the case. Here on this slide, we see some other common elements. So sulfur, capital S, is its element symbol. Gold, we already mentioned, from aurum, the Latin for golden, and that's why its symbol is capital A, lowercase u, and its English name gold has neither of those letters, but that's the way it is. Aluminum, capital A, lowercase l, and silver from argentum, the Latin again, so capital A, lowercase g, even though it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense with silver. A lot of those ancient elements known since ancient times, have names that go for Greek or Latin roots that don't always make sense, their symbol and their English name. Okay, so let's pause a moment to take some time for a learning check, see how this is going with our symbols and names. For these 3 questions, we'll be selecting the correct symbol for each of the following elements. So number 1 is calcium, and is its correct symbol A, C, B, capital C, lowercase a, or C, capital C, capital A. For number 2, nitrogen, is its symbol A, capital N, B, capital N, lowercase e, or C, capital N, lowercase a. And finally, for iron, is its symbol A, capital I, lowercase r, B, capital F, capital E, or C, capital F, lowercase e. So go ahead, take a moment, pause the video if you must, and we'll see how you did. Okay, so hopefully you caught on that number 1, calcium, is B, capital C, lowercase a. Remember, if there's 2 letters in the symbol, the first has to be a capital, the second has to be a lowercase. Choice A, the capital C, was for carbon, and then finally choice C had a capital second letter, and we know that's not allowed. Number 2, nitrogen, was A, capital N. Choice B was neon, and choice C was sodium's element symbol. And then finally iron, which is beyond those first 20 I told you to know by heart, but those of you who push themselves, as I know many of you do, to know more and more, I don't think you probably had too much trouble with iron, because you probably figured, at least looking at the answer choices, that if there was a capital F, capital E answer choice and a capital F, lowercase e answer choice, then it's probably the capital F, lowercase e, and you'd be right that C was the correct symbol for iron, and that also goes back to ancient Roman days ferrum for sword, because iron was known back in those times. Alright, so hopefully that went well. Again, if you missed iron, that is beyond where we'd have to have it committed to memory, so don't worry so much. But this is just really committing it to memory, getting used to it. It's time to make flashcards or do whatever you do for your rote memorization study, because that's really the way that you'll get to know these things. Let's try again. We'll end this subtopic with one final learning check. And again, same deal. We've got now element symbols instead of the names, and you're going to pick the name based on the symbol. So the reverse of what we just did in our previous learning check. So for number 1, the element symbol capital S, does that correspond to A, sodium, B, sulfur, or C, selenium? Number 2, the capital P, is that A, potassium, B, phlogiston, or C, phosphorus? And finally, number 3, A, capital A, lowercase g, is that A, silver, B, aegeon, or C, gold? So if you haven't already made your selections and need another moment, pause the video. Otherwise, we'll see how you did. Okay, so taking a look, number 1, the capital S, is B, sulfur. Number 2, the capital P, stands for C, phosphorus. And finally, the symbol for number 3, capital A, lowercase g, is A, silver. So hopefully that went well. And if not, as I said, there's unfortunately not much I can do to help you with this topic. It's really just getting out the flashcards or finding a way, however you do, to memorize those first 20 or so elements. Okay, but do let me know if I do have some mnemonic devices that might help your memory if you're having a really tough time with it. Otherwise, hopefully you enjoyed this topic, and we'll see you in the next subtopic for Chapter 3.